Good evening and welcome. Tonight we take a deep dive into the heart of the storm, examining the top news stories coming out of Russia this October 2023. From the battlefields of Ukraine to the halls of the Kremlin, we'll dissect the events shaping Russia's destiny and its impact on the world stage. The stakes couldn't be higher. The conflict in Ukraine rages on, a stark reminder of the human cost of war. Sanctions bite deep into the Russian economy, leaving many wondering about the future. And all the while, the Kremlin tightens its grip on dissent, leaving many Russians questioning their freedoms. Over the next hour, we'll explore these critical issues and more. We'll examine the facts, cut through the propaganda, and provide you with the context you need to understand the complex realities facing Russia today. Welcome to our deep dive into the top news topics about Russia for October 2023. From the ongoing conflict in Ukraine to the latest in Russian politics, we've got you covered. The war in Ukraine grinds on, a brutal and bloody stalemate with no end in sight. Ukrainian forces, bolstered by Western weapons and training, continue to mount a fierce defense, pushing back against Russian offensives in key strategic areas. But Russia's military, despite suffering heavy losses, shows no signs of relenting. Putin's forces continue to bombard Ukrainian cities, targeting civilian infrastructure and leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. The international community remains deeply divided. The West, led by the United States and its NATO allies, continues to supply Ukraine with military aid and impose crippling economic sanctions on Russia. Moscow, however, shows no signs of backing down. The Kremlin continues to justify its actions in Ukraine, claiming it is fighting neo-Nazis and defending its national security interests. The human toll of this conflict is staggering. Thousands of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire have lost their lives, while millions more have been displaced from their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries. The West's economic sanctions are taking a heavy toll on the Russian economy. The ruble has plummeted in value while inflation soars, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Russians. Key industries are feeling the pain, particularly the energy sector, a cornerstone of Russia's economy. European nations, once heavily reliant on Russian oil and gas, are scrambling to find alternative sources of energy. The Kremlin has responded with a series of countermeasures, including capital controls and import substitution policies, but the long-term economic outlook for Russia remains uncertain. Some experts believe that Russia's economy is more resilient than many anticipated, pointing to its vast natural resources and close ties with countries like China and India. But others warn that the sanctions are starting to bite, and that the Russian people will ultimately bear the brunt of the economic hardship. Tensions between Russia and the West have reached a fever pitch, raising fears of a wider conflict. Russia's military maneuvers near NATO borders have put Western forces on high alert. NATO, in response, has bolstered its military presence in Eastern Europe, deploying troops and equipment to member states bordering Russia. The alliance has also stepped up its rhetoric, condemning Russia's actions as unprovoked and unjustified. The Kremlin, however, accuses NATO of expansionism, and warns that any encroachment on its borders will be met with a swift and decisive response. The risk of miscalculation remains alarmingly high. Both sides are locked in a dangerous game of brinkmanship, testing each other's resolve and pushing the limits of confrontation. The situation is volatile and unpredictable. The world watches with bated breath, hoping that diplomacy will prevail and prevent this simmering tension from boiling over into a full-blown conflict. Chapter 4. In Putin's Russia, freedom of expression is under attack. The Kremlin has cracked down on independent media outlets, branding them as foreign agents and shutting down their operations. Opposition activists and critics of the government are routinely harassed, intimidated, and silenced. Many have been arrested on trumped-up charges while others have fled the country fearing for their safety. The government's control over information is tightening, leaving many Russians feeling isolated and afraid to speak out. The internet, once a haven for free expression, is now heavily censored. International human rights organizations have condemned Russia's crackdown on dissent, calling for the release of political prisoners and an end to the persecution of journalists and activists. But the Kremlin remains defiant, dismissing international criticism as interference in its internal affairs. The space for dissent in Russia is shrinking by the day. Chapter 5. Sanctions have forced Russia to find new markets for its vast energy resources, leading to a strategic pivot towards the east. China, hungry for energy to fuel its economic growth, has become a key partner for Russia. The two countries have signed a series of agreements to increase energy cooperation, including the construction of new pipelines to transport Russian oil and gas to China. Russia is also seeking to strengthen energy ties with other Asian countries, such as India, as it seeks to reduce its reliance on Western markets. This shift has significant geopolitical implications, potentially reshaping the global energy landscape and strengthening ties between Russia and non-Western powers. However, it remains to be seen whether these new partnerships can fully compensate for the loss of European markets, which were once Russia's primary energy customers. Chapter 6. Russia held local and parliamentary elections amidst the backdrop of the ongoing war in Ukraine, a conflict that has cast a long shadow over the country's political landscape. The ruling United Russia Party, loyal to President Putin, maintained its grip on power, securing a comfortable majority in the State Duma, Russia's lower house of parliament. However, the elections were marred by allegations of widespread irregularities, including voter intimidation, ballot stuffing, and the suppression of opposition candidates. International observers criticized the lack of transparency and fairness in the electoral process, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the results. The Kremlin dismissed these allegations as baseless, claiming that the elections were conducted in accordance with Russian law. Chapter 7. The New Arms Race, Russia's military might on display. Russia continues to invest heavily in its military, developing new weapons systems and modernizing its armed forces. The conflict in Ukraine has provided a testing ground for some of these new technologies. Among Russia's most advanced weapon systems is the hypersonic missile, a highly maneuverable and difficult to intercept weapon that has raised concerns in Western capitals. Russia has also made strides in the development of unmanned aerial vehicles, electronic warfare capabilities, and artificial intelligence, all of which are playing an increasingly important role in modern warfare. This military modernization has raised concerns about a new arms race, with the United States and its allies also investing heavily in their own defense capabilities. The potential for an escalation of military competition between Russia and the West is a worrying development, adding another layer of complexity to an already tense geopolitical environment. Chapter 8. A Humanitarian Catastrophe. The Human Cost of War in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has triggered a dire humanitarian crisis, with millions of civilians caught in the crossfire and facing desperate conditions. The United Nations estimates that over 10 million people have been displaced from their homes. Cities and towns across Ukraine lie in ruins, devastated by relentless shelling and airstrikes. Hospitals, schools, and residential areas have not been spared, leaving countless families without shelter, food, or medical care. The humanitarian situation is particularly dire in besieged cities where civilians are trapped without access to basic necessities. Aid organizations are struggling to reach those in need, facing bureaucratic hurdles and dangerous conditions. The international community has responded with pledges of humanitarian assistance, but the needs are overwhelming. The war in Ukraine is a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of conflict. The world must come together to provide urgent aid to those affected by this crisis and to work towards a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Chapter 9. A New World Order, Russia charts its course on the global stage. The conflict in Ukraine has had a profound impact on Russia's relations with the rest of the world. The West has largely isolated Russia diplomatically and economically, imposing sanctions and condemning its actions. However, Russia has found support from some countries, particularly China and India, which have refrained from condemning the invasion of Ukraine and have continued to engage in economic cooperation with Moscow. This has led to speculation that the world is witnessing the emergence of a new geopolitical order, one in which Russia and China are forging closer ties as they push back against what they perceive as Western dominance. Russia has also sought to strengthen its ties with countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, presenting itself as a counterweight to the West and offering an alternative to the liberal world order. The long-term implications of these geopolitical shifts are still unfolding, but it is clear that the conflict in Ukraine has accelerated a trend towards a more multipolar world. Chapter 10. Russia's uncertain future. Can the economy weather the storm? The Russian economy is facing unprecedented challenges as it grapples with the impact of Western sanctions, the war in Ukraine, and a volatile global economic environment. Inflation has soared to its highest level in decades, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Russians and putting a strain on household budgets. The ruble has experienced wild swings in value, while the central bank has imposed capital controls in an effort to stabilize the currency. The energy sector, a cornerstone of the Russian economy, has been hit hard by sanctions as European countries seek to reduce their dependence on Russian oil and gas. The government has announced a series of measures aimed at mitigating the economic impact of the crisis, including increased social spending and support for businesses. However, the long-term outlook for the Russian economy remains uncertain. Much will depend on the duration of the war in Ukraine, the trajectory of global energy markets, and the effectiveness of government policies. Chapter 11. Russia at a crossroads. As we've seen, Russia is facing a multitude of challenges. From the ongoing war in Ukraine to a deepening economic crisis and growing international isolation. The decisions made by the Kremlin in the coming months and years will have profound implications not only for Russia but for the wider world. The situation remains fluid and unpredictable. The path ahead is fraught with uncertainty, but one thing is clear: Russia is at a crossroads, and the choices it makes will shape its destiny for generations to come. Thank you for joining us for this comprehensive look at the top news topics about Russia this month. Stay tuned for more updates and in-depth analyses. As we conclude, let's summarize some key topics related to news about Russia as of October 2023. 1. The conflict continues to dominate headlines, with significant implications for global security and geopolitics. 1. Russia faces increasing economic sanctions that are impacting its economy and international trade. 1. Diplomatic relations remain strained, with ongoing confrontations on multiple fronts. 1. Domestic dissent and protests are met with harsh crackdowns, raising serious human rights concerns. 1. Russia's energy sector remains a crucial aspect of its economy with global ramifications. 1. Political maneuvers within Russia continue to shape its governance and future direction. 1. Advances in military technology highlight Russia's strategic priorities. 1. The war has led to a dire humanitarian situation with millions affected. 1. Russia's interactions with other nations are pivotal in shaping the global order. 1. Economic stability and growth remain uncertain amidst ongoing challenges. These topics will continue to evolve, and we will be here to provide you with the latest updates and analyses. Thank you for watching and stay informed.